Hey everybody, welcome. In this video, we are going to start to learn about the process of natural selection, which fits perfectly in our evolution unit. So thinking about last time, last class in entry 21, we learned about, again, variation in the natural population. So we had talked a lot about the crabs and snails and how the crabs heavily influenced the change of the snail population over time. And your kind of B page was composed of analysis questions of the experiments that Dr. Seeley had run in the lab and in the field. And then your task then was to create kind of two pictures, one of the population and two just kind of capturing a scene from the experiments, whether it was in the lab or in the field. So please, you should have done that already, and if not, hopefully soon that will be added on. Today, we're going to focus on natural selection in entry 22, and we'll be spending all week on this. Also previewing, on Thursday, we are going to be taking a quiz. So just kind of understanding that before we head off for the weekend, we're going to have a quiz over entries 19 to 22. So those were the ones about polygenetic traits. So we had talked a little bit about how certain traits like height, skin color, number of tomato seeds are kind of controlled by more than one gene. And it's this, additive effect and gives us a range of distribution that kind of looks like a bell curve. We've drawn a couple graphs on it and so on, all the way through today when we talk about natural selection. So just be prepared for that. For now, I'm going to click in and dive into entry 22. So kind of evolution in action is what I'm calling it. But our essential question for today is, how do populations become so well adapted to their surroundings? I want you to make sure that you take a moment and pause and get that down. And I put a little graphic of a raccoon in there because why not? The first thing that I'm going to do in class is just kind of going through and talking about, like, what does well adapted even mean? If our goal is to figure out how do populations become that way, what does that even mean? What's the target? So if you have a chance, hop over to the PowerPoint and watch these videos. The one on the left talks about different types of adaptations, and the one on the right talks about, I think, 25 like crazy animal adaptations that exist. But the idea here, and you don't have to write this down, is that organisms become well adapted to their environments through the process of natural selection. And, just history lesson, the father of evolution is Charles Darwin. And he, as a young scientist, hopped on the HMS Beagle, which you can see on the left. And he toured around and observed, collected evidence and data as that ship kind of sailed around to different islands. And eventually, in his older life, he published in 1859 on the origin of species. And so that is the first real publication where he published his theory of evolution by the process of natural selection. And so that's what we're going to really learn about today. We're going to go through some of the facts or observations that he made, and that can be generalized or seen with all different types of organisms. So he's famous for going to the Galapagos Islands, which I have in the map here on the right. It's kind of off of the west coast of South America. And he was really famous for studying the finches of the Galapagos Islands. Sometimes they're known as Darwin's finches. But he looked at other stuff too, like turtles and, all of the organisms, even plant life, and just kind of recorded it over time and tried to analyze their populations as it changed. And he made a couple of observations or facts that he observed, and then was able to put it all together into the idea of natural selection. So the first thing he noticed, fact number one, And this is where I want you to kind of start to write down the notes piece. I might actually recommend that you write this down as kind of a main heading, and then we're going to go through the elements of it right now. So maybe pause here and get this down in your notes, and then resume. The first fact, and we've really already learned this, is that living things have enormous biotic potential. We learned this in our entry 20. Biotic potential is kind of the maximum number of offspring that an organism can have, right? And so, as it turns out in real life, right, organisms have many more offspring than can usually survive. And we had done some fake calculations of how many organisms there would be if biotic potential was reached. Thinking about burying the slug or the world in slugs, right, in 3 generations. And at that time, we had predicted a list of things that can limit biotic potential, which we'll come back here in a few moments. But that's the first kind of general observation. Living things have enormous biotic potential. The second thing that's important to consider is that there are a lot of inherited genetic variations among living things. So there exists variety, right, between all of our traits. And that is genetic, meaning that it can be inherited from parent to offspring. There is some kind of gene origin. And so you can see on the left, one example would be coat color in bunnies. It could be height, skin color, eye color, hair texture, plant height, number of flowers, colors of flowers, all of it. Or even in the bottom right, you can see, as we had talked about with the snails, shell thickness or spire height, which is kind of how pointy they are. So there are inheritable genetic traits that have variation. That's kind of the second thing that he noticed. The third fact is that there are something called selection pressures. So that includes things like limited resources, or a selection pressure could be predators, mating preference, meaning a lot of times in certain situations, the female might choose particular attributes about the male. Weather could also be one. But regardless of the source, it makes it difficult for all individuals to survive. So if I'm talking about limited resources, for example, food is going to run out at a certain point, or maybe it's shelter. Weather might be, for example, in the picture, the snow-covered landscape, or predators. In this particular picture, foxes eat bunnies. And so what happens is the predator relationship along with the weather makes certain variations more able to blend in with the surroundings than others. And so the selection pressure here means that the ones that are able to blend in to survive are kind of selected for survival, while those that the fox is able to catch and eat, clearly those ones are selected against, because those are the ones that were going to be eaten. And therefore not be able to survive and make many, many more baby bunnies. So the general idea here is that there are selection pressures that kind of prevent organisms from hitting that biotic potential point. So make sure you've gotten a chance to pause and get those 3 facts down, because now we are going to be putting it all together and coming up with the conclusion that Darwin was able to come to by observing all of those facts. The idea was natural selection. And maybe you've heard of the idea of survival of the fittest. And so I do want you to make sure that you get this text written down. But the idea here is survival of the fittest, individuals with advantageous traits. So the variation that are best suited for the environment are able to reproduce more often, and therefore they can pass their genes on to the next generation. And then over time, that leads to a change in the genetics of the population. So similar to what we observed maybe with the snails, and you see that shift in shell thickness, for example. The only way that that shift in appearance happens is if there is an underlying shift in the genetics that creates that trait. Remember, genotype and phenotype. So if the phenotype is changing, then the underlying genetics or genotype is changing too. So if that changes in a population over time, that is literally evolution. That is the definition of evolution. So please make sure you pause and kind of get this down. And the final thing that I want to say about this too is that evolution and natural selection are not the exact same thing. They do go hand in hand, totally, but it's not the same thing. Evolution is the change in frequency or number of traits over time. Natural selection is the process by which evolution happens. So it's the name given to the process. So natural selection is that active survival of the fittest process happening in a population that leads to evolution happening, that shift in frequency of traits. So please just make a note to say that they are not the same thing. You cannot use them interchangeably. Natural selection is an active process, and the result then is evolution. Okay, so I want to segue this back to the beginning. What does it mean to adapt to something? What does it mean to be well adapted to your surroundings? That most likely means that you have the best traits suited for the environment. Or there was a shift in the population over time to the advantageous traits, and therefore those organisms are better able to survive. So they are better adapted to that situation. And so just kind of the final thing on your A page that I want you to make sure that you get down is that there are, genetic adaptations, which is evolution. The population is shifting and the beneficial traits are being passed on to future generations. But there's also behavioral adaptations. So these things might be the change in behavior of a specific individual or a population over time. It's not something that's inherited. It could be something that is learned. So not a genetic component. So there's different types of adaptations that you can think of. And just because you as an individual change does not mean that evolution is taking place. So individuals, please remember, cannot evolve. Only populations. And behavioral changes are not inherited. It can't be something that is really selected for or against in terms of evolution. It's not inheritable, so it cannot be transferred to future generations in a genetic sense. All right, so here's an example of my notes page. If it's helpful, there you go. And if not, oh, okay. But mostly just kind of getting down the definitions. We have our 3 facts and then the conclusion of natural selection there. And how it's not the same thing as, evolution and natural selection are not the same meaning. And then at the bottom, I just included the 2 types of adaptations. So what we're going to then do is look at some more examples. And depending on where we're sitting in class at the time, we might save this till Thursday, or I want to at least walk through some examples and then have you guys do it for homework that we can go over on Thursday. So to do this, we're going to need to set up the B page. And so I have the B page turned to the side because we're going to make a pretty large chart. And we're going to look at a couple of different case studies to see if we can identify the variation that exists, if there are any selection pressures that might be limiting biotic potential, and then what change might have occurred in the population. So we're going to look at a couple different real-world examples. So please pause the video, and I'm going to do this in class too and give everybody time to copy this chart on their B page. And we're going to walk through 2 examples. One with the snails that we already discussed, so that should go pretty fast and easy. And the next is with rock pocket mice. So I'm going to show a short video, and then we can walk through this as well. All right. So if you haven't gotten the table down, please pause. Otherwise, once we have it down as a class, we're going to go through and talk about that first example, the snails. So I'm going to try to do a, chat with the class to go through this, but hopefully the inheritable variation that you might have mentioned in this first column would be thickness of shell, or you could also say spire height. So the variation that is found in the population, you can see there's a distribution of shell thickness and there's a distribution of spire height. Excuse me. The selection pressure is what is limiting biotic potential. I'm going to put that in there. In this case, we had learned that it is the introduction of the European green crab, and that predation of eating the thin-shelled and not eating the thick-shelled is acting as a selection pressure. The ones that have thick shells and survive are selected for, and the ones that have thin shells are selected against. And then evolution, meaning what happened in the population over time. You can see from the graph, from bottom to top, the shell thickness shifted towards thicker. So there was a change in the inherited gene frequency, thicker shells, oops. And then if you're looking at spire height, you can see that that went down. There was a downshift in that. It was from taller towards shorter. Okay. So it's as simple as that. So in class, we're going to watch this, I think it's about 10 minutes long video of rock pocket mice in the Western United States to see if we can identify those same types of things, and we'll go through it. So please make sure you hop over to the PowerPoint and watch through the video. We will go through this next class as well. Once we go through the 2 examples, then it's really your turn. So you get to choose a minimum of 2 articles or videos. If you want to do 1 and 1, that's fine. But basically, you're going to pick 2 examples and just repeat the process. See if you can identify the variation, the pressure, and then how the population changed. I have 6 different options to choose from on the next slide, but you're going to choose 2 and then add them to your table. So by the time the next class rolls around, you should have a complete table. And here are your different options. So you can see the first real 4 are videos and the last 2 are articles. They are all linked out, so you should be able to click on them and just kind of watch through. And I labeled the organism, so if you want, and sickle cell is actually the disease, humans, and blood cells, but otherwise I've named the organism. So if any of those particularly interest you, they're all different examples highlighting the same aspects. So choose whatever two you might want, and then see if you can use the information provided to fill in your chart. If you want to learn a little bit more about natural selection, there is a reading. There's also some extra videos on the right-hand side that you are more than welcome to watch that kind of explain the process, if that helps. So today what we've done is we learned the components of natural selection as that part of that process. We've also learned that natural selection is a process by which evolution takes place. And we've also been able to identify evolution happening in real populations with the case studies, the snails, the pocket mice, and any of the two that you happen to choose from your own selves. So the goal is to finish, or at least get close to finishing, entry 22, that B page. I want to go over some of those case studies next time. And then just be prepared. Again, there's going to be a quiz on Thursday. We'll review first, and then we'll do the quiz towards the end of the hour on entries 19 to 22. So I just want to be upfront, and you'll be able to use your notes and all of that. So just highlighting that point. All right, everybody. That's it for today. Thank you.